Episode 3, Why Cash Flow Matters More Than Profit. Drive through almost any high-end development around where I live, and you'll see something that looks permanent. Custom homes, stone, steel, 3-car garages, outdoor living spaces with heaters built in the ceilings, every driveway perfectly poured, every trim detail sharp. It feels stable. It feels established. It feels like whoever built these homes must have figured something out. And then you ask somebody casually, hey, who built in this neighborhood? And sometimes they'll tell you a name. And sometimes they'll tell you something that sticks with you. Oh, that builder? They're not in business anymore. The first time I heard that, I didn't understand it. Not emotionally, not mathematically. I remember thinking, how is that even possible? You're building $3, $4, $5 million houses at once. There's trucks on site. There's crews moving everywhere. There's a brand presence. There's signs all over the place. How do you go from that to gone? When I was younger in business, I assumed that scale meant safety. I thought the biggest risk was not having enough work. I thought if you could just get enough jobs lined up, enough revenue under contract, everything would smooth out. More contracts means more profit. More profit means more stability. And more stability means less stress. Or at least that's the story I told myself. And honestly, that's the story that most builders tell themselves. Because when you're small, the pain is obvious. You're chasing leads, you're worrying about the next job, you're hoping that the phone rings. So it feels intuitive to think that once you're running multiple large projects at the same time, that pressure will ease. But what no one talks about, what no one warns you about, is that scaling a construction company is actually one of the riskiest phases of your entire career. Not because you don't know how to build, not because clients stop calling, but because the financial exposure multiplies much faster than you think. I've walked through these neighborhoods with gorgeous homes and quietly wondered what really happened behind the scenes. Was it bad estimating? Was it a lawsuit? Was it market timing? Or was it something much less dramatic and much more common? Because what I've learned over the years is that most builders don't disappear because they couldn't build. They disappear because they misunderstood cash. They confused revenue with liquidity. They confused backlog with safety. They thought having 5 $1 million homes under contract meant that they were secure, when in reality, it meant that they were carrying more than 5 times the amount of financial exposure. And that misunderstanding doesn't show up immediately. It creeps in slowly. Everything looks fine. The trucks are busy. The schedule is full. The revenue is strong. You feel the momentum. Until one day you realize the number in your bank account doesn't mean what you thought it meant. That's what this episode is about. Because if you don't deeply understand the difference between profit and cash flow, growth can quietly become the thing that takes you out. Let's slow this down a little and actually run the numbers, because this is where the illusion generally starts to break. Imagine you're running one $1 million custom home. You've structured your contract in draws, maybe 5 or 6 over the course of the build. Your client pays you back in phases: foundation, framing, rough-in, drywall, finishes, and CO. Now, let's look at your monthly cash reality. During framing and rough-ins, you might have $120,000 in subcontractor payouts, $80,000 in lumber and materials, $35,000 in payroll and supervision, and $15,000 in overhead allocation. That's roughly $250,000 in outgoing cash in a single month. Now, maybe your draw hits 30 days later, maybe 45. Sometimes inspections delay that. Sometimes your paperwork lags. Sometimes lenders slow things down. So at any given moment, you might need $200,000 to $300,000 in available cash just to comfortably float one project. And that's a lot of money, but it's manageable. Now let's scale it. Instead of one $1 million project, you're running 5. And here's where builders make the first mistake. They assume that the exposure multiplies evenly, and it doesn't, because construction phases overlap. Project A is in framing, Project B is in foundation, Project C is in rough ends, Project D is ordering windows, Project E is paying out CO. Your cash obligations don't stack neatly, they start to collide. Now, your monthly outgoing might look like this: 500 to 700,000 in subcontractor payouts, 350 to 500,000 in material packages, 150,000 in payroll, and 60 to 100,000 in overhead and fixed costs. Suddenly, you're spending close to $1 million a month before reimbursement. And your draws, they're staggered. Some hit on time, some don't. One inspection delay on a $250,000 draw doesn't just delay your profit, it strains liquidity across all of your projects. And here's the question most builders never ask: what is my peak cash exposure across all active projects at the same time? Not my projected profit, not my total contract value, my peak cash exposure. Because if your total exposure across 5 jobs reaches $1.5 million before reimbursement, and you only have $400,000 available, you're financing growth whether you realize it or not. And financing growth isn't automatically bad, but it becomes dangerous when it's unintentional. Let me give you the general counter argument that I've heard. The money comes in. The draws always cover it. And most of the time, yes, until it doesn't. So what happens when a lender reevaluates their inspection timing, or a client disputes a change order before signing the next draw, or a material delivery requires payment earlier than expected, or weather pushes work out 2 weeks and shifts the draw schedule? Construction is a timing business. Spend happens immediately and reimbursement happens later. So scaling increases the size of that timing gap. And that gap is where builders get into trouble. Because when you're small, a $50,000 delay hurts, but when you're scaled, a $250,000 delay can cascade. One delayed draw affects your vendor payments. Vendor strain affects your credit terms. Credit terms affect your flexibility, and flexibility affects your survival. And the most dangerous part, from the outside, everything still looks strong. You have 5 $1 million contracts. You're booked out. Your revenue is high, but if you don't have liquidity proportional to your exposure, you're operating on tension. And tension doesn't show up in a profit and loss statement. It shows up in your bank balance. It shows up in how well you sleep. It shows up in how quickly you feel pressure when something shifts. This is why scaling feels powerful and fragile at the same time. And it's why cash flow, not profit, is the real measurement of stability. Our 5th year in business was supposed to be a breakthrough year. Revenue was higher than it had ever been. We had more projects running simultaneously than at any other point in our career. We had upgraded our office. We had more staff. From the outside, it looked like the natural progression of a growing company. I remember sitting at my desk and at the end of the year, reviewing the numbers and looking at the top line, and it looked incredible. It was a number that a few years prior, I would have celebrated for weeks. We had arrived, or at least that's what I thought. Then I looked at the bottom line. We had made less money that year than we had the year previous. Less than when we were smaller. Less than when we had fewer employees. Less than when we had fewer projects. And that's when something about me shifted. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't anger. It was fear. I remember thinking, did I just jeopardize the entire company by being ambitious? Because we weren't failing. We weren't losing money on paper, but the margin that we thought we were building had quietly been consumed. Consumed by interest, consumed by timing gaps, and consumed by the cost of carrying more exposure than we had prepared for. We had scaled revenue faster than we had scaled liquidity, and the pressure was real. I started running scenarios in my head at night. What if two draws hit late at the same time? What if one client delays their payment? What if one major material package had to be paid up front and we weren't reimbursed for 45 days? What if we had to choose between preserving cash and keeping somebody employed? And that last one hit the hardest. Because when you hire people, you take on the responsibility for their stability. It's not just your risk anymore. And that year, for the first time, I felt like I may have exposed them to something that I didn't fully understand. The hardest part is that nothing outwardly looked wrong. We were busy. We were respected. And at the end of the year, after interest and fees, we walked away with far less than we had expected. It was a humbling realization. Growth had masked our fragility. Revenue had hidden our exposure. And I realized something uncomfortable. If one serious disruption had happened in that year, a lawsuit, a market pause, a supply chain shock, we would have been vulnerable. Not because we didn't have work, but because we didn't have enough cash cushion relative to the work that we had. That year changed how I think about ambition. Before that, growth felt like validation. After that, growth felt like leverage. And leverage amplifies everything, good and bad. I don't regret scaling, but I regret not fully understanding the cash math behind scaling. Because it wasn't the size of the jobs that created the stress, it was the timing. It was the invisible gap between outgoing cash and incoming reimbursement. And once I saw it clearly, I could never unsee it. That was the year I stopped asking, how big can we get? And I started asking, how much exposure can we safely carry? That's a very different question, and it leads to very different decisions. There's a phrase in construction that gets tossed around almost casually: robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's usually said with a half smile, like it's just part of the game, like it's something that scrappy builders do while they're growing. But let's actually talk about what that means. It means that you receive a $150,000 deposit on job B, and you use it or part of it to pay a lumber invoice on job A. It means you're waiting on a $200,000 draw from your first project, so you float payroll using a recent payment from your second project. It means that the cash inside of your company isn't cleanly tied to individual jobs. It's pulled and moving constantly to keep everything alive. And in the moment, it doesn't feel reckless. It feels temporary. It feels like you're just smoothing timing gaps. And so you tell yourself, the draw is coming. The lender will release it next week. This will even things out. And most of the time it does, until it doesn't. So here's how the tension builds. Project A is mid-framing and needs a $90,000 payment to the framer. Project B just delivered windows and requires $60,000 upon delivery. Project C's electrician is 30 days out and expecting a $45,000 check. You've got $300,000 sitting in the bank, which feels healthy, but $200,000 of that is allocated for upcoming materials, $70,000 is for payroll next week, and suddenly your available cash cushion is very thin. Then one inspection doesn't go through, and now you're juggling. You delay a vendor payment for 5 days. You move payroll out by 48 hours. You ask a subcontractor to just wait until Friday. None of these decisions feel catastrophic individually, but they create strain, and that strain compounds. Vendor trust is built on consistency, and once you age invoices past their terms, suppliers start to tighten credit. And once suppliers tighten their credit, your flexibility shrinks and your margin compresses. So the dangerous part about this is, from the outside, you're still very busy. You still have 5 jobs running. You still have signed contracts, but internally, your projects are now financially intertwined. One delayed draw impacts every job that you've got. One client dispute ripples across your payroll. One unexpected material increase forces you to borrow. And this is how builders with full backlogs collapse. not because they didn't have the work, but because they stacked timing risk on top of timing risk. And the uncomfortable truth is, almost every growing builder does this at some point, including us. We didn't call it robbing Peter to pay Paul. We called it managing cash. But when projects depend on each other's deposits to stay alive, you are exposed. And the larger you scale, the more fragile that structure becomes. Because if one major disruption hits, one market slowdown, one lending delay, one vendor tightening their terms, the whole system tightens instantly. And that's not a profit problem. That's a cash structure problem. And it's one most builders don't recognize until they feel the pressure. There's something deeply misleading about profit in construction. At the end of the year, your accountant sends you a P&L and it shows your revenue. It shows you the cost of goods sold. It shows you your gross margin and it shows you your net profit. And if that bottom line is positive, it feels very validating. It feels like proof that you're doing everything right. But here's the disconnect. Profit is measured over time. Cash is measured right now. Profit tells you how you performed across 12 months. Cash tells you whether payroll clears next Friday. These are not the same things. And the emotional weight of that difference is extremely heavy. There were nights during that 5th year that I would stare at the ceiling running math in my head. If 2 of our projects slip at the same time, what happens? If a lender delays one inspection, how tight does that make everything? If I need to float $300,000 for 45 days, where does that come from? And on paper, we were profitable. But profitability doesn't eliminate timing risk. It doesn't guarantee liquidity. It doesn't guarantee that the money you've technically earned already is going to be sitting in your bank account when you need it. Construction accounting allows revenue to be recognized based on the percentage of completion. So you can show $500,000 in earned profit on paper while your bank account holds far less available cash. The gap between earned and available is where anxiety lives, and it changes how you lead. It changes how you make decisions. It changes how you respond when somebody asks to add overhead. It changes how you think about hiring. You start asking different questions, not can we grow, but can we float this? Not is this job going to be profitable, but when does the cash from this job actually hit the bank account? I remember one specific moment during that year when we had multiple large invoices due across multiple projects. And again, on paper, everything was fine, but our available liquidity was thinner than I was comfortable with. And I could feel it physically, the tightness in your chest, the quiet pressure behind your eyes, the awareness that if something unexpected happens, you don't have much room. That feeling doesn't show up on your financial statements. It doesn't show up in your revenue number. It doesn't even show up in the awards that you win, but it shows up in how well you sleep. It shows up in how quickly you react to small issues. And it shows up in the way you carry stress into your home. This is where I think many builders misunderstand growth. They chase profit. They chase revenue. They chase backlog. But what they're really chasing, whether or not they know it, is stability. And stability doesn't come from margin alone. It comes from liquidity, from reserve, from knowing that if 2 projects stall at once, your company doesn't. Once I realized that, everything shifted. Profit stopped being the scoreboard. Cash became the foundation. Because you can survive a low margin year, but you cannot survive a liquidity crisis. And that distinction alone is what separates companies that endure from companies that disappear. Once you start seeing your business through this lens, something very interesting happens. You stop measuring success by how busy you are. You stop chasing volume just for the sake of growth. You start asking a better question. Is that work actually making the company stronger? Because one of the biggest traps in construction is confusing activity with progress. Just because your schedule is full, just because your trucks are moving, just because the phone keeps ringing, doesn't mean that the business itself isn't improving. And in the next episode, I want to talk about that idea, why busy is not the same as successful, and how a lot of builders quietly trap themselves in businesses that look impressive from the outside, but don't actually provide the stability or freedom that they were chasing. Thank you for listening to Brickonomics, the Business of Building. I'll see you in the next one.